Paul says, when one of you Christians has a grievance against another Christian, does he dare to go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? In other words, have you so missed it that when the inevitable happens, and the inevitable will happen, by the way, some Christian will offend you? Have you so forgotten your responsibility that when that happens, you would be so bold as to duke it out in front of unbelievers instead of taking care of these private matters in the context of the local church? The general principle, I think Paul is saying that believers should never take unbelievers to court when it comes to lawsuits. Now, before you push back, let me kind of unpack things a little bit. One of the reasons that Paul was so upset is because in Greek culture, taking people to court was like an everyday occurrence. William Barclay said that in a Greek city, every man was a lawyer. Could you imagine? How many of you love jury duty? Exactly. Nobody. Well, in this community, in this city, everyone loved jury duty. It was something that most people did with their free time. Greek people would spend the majority of their free time either listening to cases or listening to lawsuits or helping to decide lawsuits. I found cases in which some juries would have up to 40 people. Okay, that's pretty crazy. Not 12. Some would have up to 400. And then there's one documented case in ancient Greek culture of 6,000 people as a jury. Now, that's a hung jury. Okay, you cannot persuade 6,000 people, but this was the case because they loved going to court. It was something that they enjoyed doing. It was sport, and the reason is because the courtroom had nothing to do with justice. It had nothing to do with who was right or who was wrong. It had everything to do with how gifted the person was with rhetoric, how good he could assassinate the other person's character, and how much money that person had in order to buy off the judge and to pay off the jury. So if you were rich and influential, then more than likely you were going to win the lawsuit. It was a very corrupt system for pursuing justice. And so Paul's saying, since that's the case, and here you are as believers, and you should care about the truth, and you should certainly care about broadcasting these grotesque grievances in front of unbelieving people, and especially unbelieving judges who are likely paid off and corrupt. The Christian has no place in these kinds of environments when it comes to settling disputes, and so stop taking one another to court. Christians should never take Christians to court in terms of lawsuit. Now, that does not mean that Christians shouldn't go to court to pursue justice. Paul himself went to court. You can see it in the book of Acts. Paul leverages the Roman government and the court system in order to protect his rights and to further the gospel. Sometimes in our culture today, you just got to admit it, sometimes there are exceptions to this rule. This is the general rule, but there's exceptions to the rule. Sometimes, especially if you maybe were part of a divorce that you didn't want anything to do with, or it was just, it had to be done because of the circumstances. You couldn't get out of it, and in our culture, that you go to the courtroom to do that, and you can't avoid it, and that's just the way it is. Sometimes protecting children involves you going into the courthouse and making decisions that are necessary for the protection of a child. And so Paul isn't making sweeping judgment that wouldn't take into account special situations, but the general principle is that when it comes to believer A and believer B, and they have a grievance with one another, the starting point should not be the courthouse. The starting point should be settling the dispute in the context of the church. And the reasons for that are because when you go before unbelievers and you duke it out and air out your dirty laundry, what you're communicating to the world is that the gospel makes absolutely no difference when it comes to reconciling my relationships. So he says in verse 1, how dare you go to court and air out your dirty laundry? I can't believe that you would do this.